7:23 a.m., September 5, 1940. British Royal Air Force Squadron leader Kenneth Morrison froze at the edge of Hucknall Airfield in Nottinghamshire. Before his very eyes, something impossible was unfolding. A German prisoner of war. A man who, just 48 hours prior, had been escorted back to the POW camp in handcuffs, was sitting in the cockpit of a British Supermarine Spitfire Mark II. The engine was already roaring to life. In that instant, Morrison realized they hadn't just lost a prisoner. They were facing the most audacious escape attempt the Royal Air Force had ever seen. This wasn't just any German soldier. This was First Lieutenant Franz von Werra, aged 27, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot, known among his comrades as the Baron von Werra, and over the next 37 minutes, he would challenge the British air defense systems in a way that continues to leave military historians speechless even 80 years later. This story doesn't begin on that September morning. It begins 3 weeks earlier, on August 15, 1940, over the green fields of Kent, as the Battle of Britain raged at its peak. Franz von Werra was flying his Messerschmitt Bf 109E4 in a formation of 40 German fighters, escorting German bombers over the English Channel. He was already a seasoned pilot with 8 confirmed aerial victories, making him an ace. But what set him apart wasn't just his flying skill. It was his confidence, bordering on arrogance, and his unyielding will to be free. But that day, everything was about to change. British Spitfires from 41st Squadron attacked his formation. In the ensuing dogfight, von Werra suddenly felt a violent jolt. A bullet had struck his engine block. Black smoke billowed from the engine. The temperature gauge shot into the red zone. He had mere seconds to decide, crash with the plane or bail out. Von Werra chose to bail out. At 14,000 feet, he ejected the canopy and launched himself into the English sky. His parachute opened, and as he floated slowly toward the earth, he watched his Messerschmitt plummet to the ground in a death spiral. Below him lay enemy territory, not Normandy, which he knew, not neutral Swiss territory, which some of his comrades had reached. This was the heart of the British Empire, and he was completely alone. He landed in a field near the village of Love's Farm in Kent. British Home Guard soldiers reached him within minutes. They found a tall, blonde German officer in full Luftwaffe uniform, standing upright, refusing to raise his hands. Franz von Werra spoke fluent English. His first words to his captors weren't pleas for mercy. They were a demand. I demand to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The British were both impressed and irritated. This German pilot wasn't behaving like a defeated enemy. He was behaving like a guest, awaiting his departure. And that's precisely what von Werra believed. For him, captivity wasn't defeat. It was merely a temporary obstacle. The RAF initially transferred him to the interrogation centre in London, then to the Grizedale Hall prisoner of war camp in the Lake District. There, the British made a fateful decision. They placed von Werra with other Luftwaffe pilots. What they didn't understand, German fighter pilots weren't ordinary prisoners of war. They were elite fighters with engineering training, who had spent years trained to act precisely under pressure, and they had a code of honor. It was their duty to escape. Von Werra immediately began planning. He studied the guard routines. He observed the shift changes. He mapped every corner of the camp, but above all, he spoke with other prisoners and gathered information about British airfields. One of these prisoners, a bomber pilot named Captain Werner Schmidt, casually mentioned something crucial. There were maintenance airfields nearby, where Spitfires were parked for repairs, sometimes with the keys in the ignition. That's when von Werra's plan began to take shape. He wouldn't just escape, he would fly a British fighter plane back to Germany. On December 17, 1940, he made his first escape attempt. Together with 4 other officers, he dug a tunnel under the barbed wire fence. They worked at night, while other prisoners kept watch. After 3 weeks, the tunnel was complete. On a freezing December night, 5 German officers crawled through the hole and disappeared into the darkness. Von Werra immediately separated from the group. He had his own destination. He marched 9 miles through the snowy English countryside to Hucknall airfield. He reached it in the early morning. What he saw there made his heart race. On the tarmac, there were at least 12 Spitfires. Some were covered, others were ready for test flights. Security was LAX. It was a maintenance airfield, not an operational base. The guards were focused on the gates, not the airfield itself. Von Werra hid in a hangar and waited until dawn. He watched the mechanics arrive, drinking coffee, chatting. He saw a test pilot start a Spitfire, and fly a circuit and land, and then, around 7:02 a.m., he saw his chance. A mechanic left a Spitfire Mark II with the engine running and went back into the hangar building, presumably to get tools. This was the moment. Von Werra sprinted from his hiding place. He was still wearing his Luftwaffe uniform, but from a distance he could be mistaken for an RAF pilot. He climbed onto the wing, swung into the cockpit, and strapped himself in. His hands flew over the instruments. Messerschmitts and Spitfires had different cockpits, but the basic principles were the same: throttle, elevators, rudder, ailerons. He had studied the Spitfire in British reconnaissance photos. Now he was inside one. The engine was already idling. Von Werra pushed the throttle forward. The Spitfire began to roll. Behind him, he heard shouts. Squadron leader Morrison and 2 mechanics were running across the tarmac, waving wildly. Von Werra ignored them. He aligned the aircraft with the runway. The wind was coming from the west at 12 knots. Perfect. He pushed the throttle all the way forward. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roared to life with 1,140 horsepower. The Spitfire accelerated 50 miles per hour, 75, 100. At 110 miles per hour, Von Werra pulled back on the control stick. The aircraft lifted off. He was in the AR, over England, in a British fighter plane. It was 7:23 a.m. On the ground. All hell broke loose. Morrison grabbed the radio and alerted RAF command in Nottingham. German prisoner has stolen a Spitfire. Course unknown, probably heading east. Within minutes, alarm sirens were wailing at 3 British airfields. Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons scrambled to intercept. The entire air defense of eastern England was activated. Anti-aircraft batteries received orders to fire. The impossible had happened, and the Royal Air Force was mobilizing everything to stop it. The Baron von Werra was flying low, only 1,000 feet above the ground. He followed roads and railway lines eastward toward the coast. His plan was simple: cross the North Sea, reach the Dutch coast, then head south to Germany. The Spitfire Mark II had a range of about 470 miles. That was enough. Just barely. But he had a problem, one he was only now noticing. The fuel gauge showed only 3/4 full. The plane hadn't been completely filled. He calculated quickly. At full throttle, he had maybe 45 minutes of flight time. Maximum. That was going to be tight, very tight. The English countryside rushed beneath him. Fields, villages, forests. At this altitude, he was hard to detect on radar, but he was also visible to anyone looking up, and the British were looking up. For weeks, German bombers had been attacking their cities. Every unknown aircraft was suspect, near Lincoln. Von Werra spotted the first pursuing fighters, 2 Hurricane fighters, about 1.25 miles behind him, at an altitude of 2,600 feet. They hadn't positively identified him yet. A Spitfire was a British plane. Why would they shoot at it? Von Werra took advantage of that. He flew in straight lines, no aggressive maneuvers. He acted like an RAF pilot on a routine flight, but the Hurricanes were getting closer. They radioed him, demanding that he transmit his identification. Von Werra had no identification. He tried to find the radio switch to respond, but the British radios were coded differently than the German ones. He could hear them, but he couldn't answer. The Hurricanes grew suspicious. One pulled up on his left side. The pilot looked over at him. Von Werra turned his face away, staring straight ahead. Seconds ticked by. Then, the Hurricane pilot noticed something. The uniform. The pilot's uniform in the Spitfire wasn't RAF blue. It was grey-blue. Luftwaffe grey-blue. The Hurricane fell back. Von Werra knew what that meant. They'd recognized him. He had seconds before they opened fire. He jerked the plane into a steep left turn and dove, almost down to treetop level. The Hurricanes followed, but at this altitude, they couldn't risk shooting. Any bullet that missed would fall on British soil. Von Werra was flying desperately now. He used every rise in the ground, every group of trees as cover. The Hurricanes stayed on his tail, but they couldn't fire. That was his only chance. The coast had to be near. Maybe 12 miles, maybe 9. Then he saw them. The anti-aircraft batteries. British flak guns near Grimsby had received orders to fire on any unidentified aircraft flying east. They opened fire. Black clouds of smoke exploded around von Werra's Spitfire Mark II. He felt the shockwaves rattle the plane. A piece of shrapnel pierced the right wing, and then the worst thing. The engine began to sputter. He was running out of fuel. He looked at the gauge. Almost empty. He'd been flying for 37 minutes. 37 minutes of freedom. 37 minutes in which a German prisoner of war had made a fool of the entire Royal Air Force. The coast was in sight. He could see the sea. But the plane was losing altitude. The engine cut out. The propeller was idling. Von Werra had no choice. He had to crash land. Beneath him was an open field near the village of Saltfleet. He steered the Spitfire toward it. The landing was rough. The plane touched down, skidded 260 feet across the grass. A landing gear broke off. The Spitfire came to a halting, lurching stop. Von Werra was unharmed. He opened the cockpit, climbed out, and stood on British soil, only 2.5 miles from the coast. So close. So desperately close. British soldiers surrounded him within minutes. This time, there were no polite words. They threw him to the ground, tied him up, and dragged him into a military vehicle. Squadron leader Morrison arrived 20 minutes later. He looked at Von Werra, sitting motionless in the vehicle, and just shook his head. "You're insane," Morrison said. "Absolutely insane. Do you know you flew a Spitfire for 37 minutes without ever having flown one before? Do you know the entire Royal Air Force was after you?" Von Werra looked at him with that confidence that, even now, in chains, wasn't broken. "I almost escaped," he said in English. "Almost." The British immediately transferred him to a maximum security prison camp, but the story wasn't over. The Royal Air Force opened an official investigation. How had a prisoner of war stolen a plane? How could security have failed so catastrophically? And the question that worried them the most: what would have happened if he'd succeeded? They found the answer in the documents Von Werra had been carrying. He had a map of all the key RAF airfields between Nottinghamshire and the coast. He'd noted down the frequencies of British radio transmitters. He documented the shift change times of the guards. If Franz von Werra had reached Germany, he wouldn't have arrived empty-handed. He would have brought information that would have been invaluable to the Luftwaffe. But the most amazing thing was yet to come. In January 1941, just 4 weeks after his Spitfire escape attempt, von Werra made his next escape attempt. The British had decided to transfer him to Canada, along with other troublesome prisoners. The transport was by ship. and then by a prisoner train across Canada. On January 24, 1941, Franz von Werra jumped from the moving train. In -4°F weather, in the Canadian wilderness, he marched 18 miles through snow and ice to the US border. The USA was still neutral at this point. He crossed the frozen St. Lawrence River, reached American territory, and claimed asylum. The Americans were in a diplomatic bind. On one hand, they were allies of Great Britain. On the other hand, they were officially neutral, and von Werra had reached US soil. After weeks of negotiations, they decided not to extradite him. Von Werra was released and traveled back to Germany via Mexico, Japan, and the Soviet Union. He was the only German prisoner of war to escape from British captivity in both Great Britain and Canada and make it back to Germany. The only one. In Germany, he was celebrated as a hero. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry produced newsreels about his escape. He was promoted to captain. He wrote a book about his experiences that became a bestseller, and he returned to the Luftwaffe to continue fighting. But the story of Franz von Werra had a tragic end. On October 25, 1941, just 9 months after his return, he crashed over the North Sea. His aircraft, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, suffered engine failure. This time there was no rescue. His body was never found. He was 28 years old. The irony is bitter. A man who jumped from a moving train, marched through ice and snow, stole an enemy aircraft and flew it for 37 minutes over enemy territory, died from a simple engine failure. But his legacy survived. In post-war British analyses, von Werra's Spitfire escape is described as one of the most shocking security incidents of the war. It led to a complete overhaul of prisoner-of-war camp security. Airfields received new safeguards. Prisoners were more strictly guarded. The entire doctrine changed. Because a single German pilot had shown just how vulnerable the system was, for the Luftwaffe, von Werra became a symbol, not because of his kill numbers. He had only 8 confirmed victories. Far from the great aces like Erich Hartmann or Gerhard Backhorn, he became a symbol because of his courage, his desperation, his refusal to give up. German fighter pilot schools told his story for decades as an example of sheer determination. The Spitfire he flew was repaired after his emergency landing and returned to service. It flew operational missions for another 2 years before being scrapped in 1943. British pilots who flew it knew its history. They jokingly called it the Baron's machine. Some claimed it brought good luck. None of the pilots who flew that specific Spitfire were ever shot down. There's a moment in this story that still puzzles military historians today. It's the 37 minutes. In those 37 minutes, Franz von Werra flew over heavily guarded British territory, pursued by fighters, shelled by anti-aircraft fire, without radio communication, in an aircraft he'd never flown before. And he came damn close to pulling it off. If the Spitfire had been fully fueled, would he have made it? The calculations say yes. With a full tank, he would have had the range to cross the North Sea and reach the Dutch coast. And then, what? Would he have made it through the German lines without being shot down by his own anti-aircraft guns? A Spitfire with British markings over German territory would have been a death sentence. But maybe that wasn't the point at all. Maybe Franz von Werra was never concerned with whether he would succeed. Maybe he was only concerned with the fact that he had to try. For a fighter pilot, trained on attack, speed and initiative, captivity was the worst form of defeat. Not death, not injury, but doing nothing, waiting, passivity. Von Werra was the opposite of passive. From the moment of his capture to his death, he fought. He saw captivity as another form of combat. The enemy was the fences, the guards, the rules. And like in air combat, all it took was a single moment of inattention from the enemy to seize victory. The British respected him for it, even as they hunted him. Squadron leader Morrison later wrote in his memoirs, "I met many brave men in the war, but von Werra was something special. He refused to accept that anything was impossible. If I'm honest, I would have been almost disappointed if he hadn't tried to escape." In Germany, his story was made into a movie in 1957. The film was called The Star of Africa, even though von Werra never fought in North Africa. The title was a reference to his escape, which circled the world. The film was a success, but it romanticized a lot. It showed a daredevil hero without doubts, without fear. The reality was more complex. The actual documents released decades later show a different von Werra. They show the letters he wrote from captivity. They show a man who was afraid of being forgotten, afraid that the war would go on without him, afraid that he would become useless. His escape attempts were not just fulfilling his duty, they were acts of desperation. There's a letter he wrote from Grizedale Hall shortly before his first escape attempt. He wrote to his mother in Germany. The letter was intercepted by British censors and never sent, but it survived in the archives. Von Werra wrote, "I cannot stay here, not because the conditions are bad, they treat us correctly, but because every day here is a lost day. I hear the planes above us, and I know my comrades are fighting without me. I cannot bear it." With that is the human Franz von Werra, not the invincible hero of propaganda, but a young man, 27 years old, trapped in a foreign land, desperately seeking purpose. His Spitfire escape was not just tactics, it was a cry for relevance. What set him apart from other prisoners of war was his technical understanding. Von Werra had studied engineering before the war. He understood aircraft not just as a pilot, but as a mechanic. When he saw the Spitfire at Hucknall Airfield, he immediately recognized that it was a Mark II, not the older Mark I. He knew that the Mark II had a more powerful engine and better flight characteristics. He knew the controls were more sensitive, that the turning radius was tighter. That knowledge probably saved his life. When the Hurricanes pursued him, he flew the Spitfire in ways that would have impressed even British test pilots. He flew low-altitude maneuvers that a normal pilot would never have risked. The British later wondered, where did he learn to fly a Spitfire like that? They found the answer in the interrogations of the other prisoners of war from Grizedale Hall. The German pilots had an informal training club in the camp. They discussed the weaknesses and strengths of Allied aircraft. They reconstructed dogfights in detail. They learned from each other. One pilot who had fought against Spitfires shared his knowledge of their flight characteristics. Another, who had seen a Spitfire on the ground, sketched the cockpit layout. It was collective intelligence. And von Werra, he absorbed it all. He prepared himself for a chance that might never come, and when it did, he was ready. This preparation was typical of German fighter pilots of that era. They weren't just trained as pilots, they were trained as tactical thinkers. They learned to analyze situations, identify weaknesses, and seize the initiative. Von Werra applied these principles to his imprisonment. He analyzed the POW camp like a military objective. He identified weaknesses, and he seized the initiative at the right moment. Those 37 minutes in the Spitfire were the culmination of this mindset. Every decision he made in the air was the result of weeks of mental preparation. When the Hurricanes pursued him, he already knew. They wouldn't shoot at low altitude. When the flak targeted him, he knew where the batteries were and how to fly around them. When the fuel ran low, he already had emergency landing spots in mind. This wasn't accident, this was training. That had become instinct. There's a detail in the British reports that's particularly remarkable. When von Werra landed the Spitfire, and was surrounded by soldiers, they found a self-drawn map in his pocket. The map didn't just show the route to the coast, it showed alternative routes. It showed diversionary airfields, it showed hiding places. Von Werra had a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. The British realized if he had escaped, he would have known where to go. This attention to detail was what shocked the Royal Air Force the most. They had assumed that an escape attempt would be impulsive, driven by desperation. What they found was the opposite, a methodically planned military strike, executed with the same precision as a bombing raid. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the commander of RAF Fighter Command, during the Battle of Britain, personally received a report about the incident. His response has been preserved in the archives. This incident shows that we are dealing with opponents who will never give up. We must ensure that our security measures match this determination. That was the greatest compliment a British commander could give to a German prisoner of war. After von Werra's death, in October 1941, the Luftwaffe held a memorial ceremony. Over 200 pilots attended. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring personally gave a speech. He said, "First Lieutenant Franz von Werra has shown us again what it means to be a fighter pilot. It's not the kill count that defines a pilot. It's the spirit, the will to fight, even when the battle seems hopeless." That is the legacy of First Lieutenant Franz von Werra. For propaganda, it was perfect. For the pilots, who knew the reality of war, it was something different. They knew that von Werra's courage was also desperation. They knew that his escape attempt wasn't just heroism, but also fear of insignificance. They didn't honor him because he was invincible. They honored him because he was human and still fought. The story of First Lieutenant Franz von Werra became part of the collective memory after the war. In Germany, it was told as an example of soldiership. In Britain, as a warning against complacency. In both cases, it was simplified. The real von Werra, with his doubts, his fear, his desperation, disappeared behind the myth. It wasn't until the 1990s, when both German and British archives were fully opened, that a more complete picture emerged. Historians found the interrogation transcripts. They found the testimonies of fellow prisoners. They found the British investigation reports. And they found something surprising. Most of the British officers who dealt with von Werra liked him. Squadron leader Morrison wrote later, "Von Werra was arrogant, cocky, and absolutely impossible to control, and yet you couldn't help but respect him. He lived by his own rules, but those rules had integrity. He never tried to harm civilians. He never threatened guards with violence. He played the game on his terms, but he played fair." That was perhaps the most astonishing thing about First Lieutenant Franz von Werra. In a time when war often meant brutality, he retained a personal code of honor. When he stole the Spitfire, he could have sabotaged it for subsequent pilots. He didn't. He just wanted to escape, not to destroy. Those 37 minutes in the air are now part of aviation history. Flight instructors use the story to teach about emergency management. How do you react when you're put into an unfamiliar cockpit? Von Werra showed a method. Focus on the basics: throttle, rudder, elevator. Everything else is secondary. Military historians discuss the tactical decisions. Should he have flown higher to conserve fuel? Should he have tried to communicate with the hurricanes and impersonate an RAF pilot? Should he have landed differently? The debates continue. 80 years later. But the most important question is perhaps a different one. What can we learn from First Lieutenant Franz von Werra, not about air combat tactics, but about human determination? He showed that the greatest obstacles often exist in our minds. The British thought it was impossible to escape from a high-security POW camp. Von Werra did not think so, and because he didn't think so, he found a way. That doesn't mean we should all become criminals. Von Werra's actions were justified in the context of war by the Geneva Convention, which states that prisoners of war have the right to attempt escape, but the principle is universal. If we believe something is impossible, it will be. If we are willing to see opportunities where others see walls, we can achieve the impossible. First Lieutenant Franz von Werra died in 1941, but his story lives on. The Spitfire he flew no longer exists. Hucknall Airfield has been closed. The Grisdale Hall POW camp is now a hotel. The physical places have vanished, but the lesson remains. In the latest declassified documents, there's a letter from a British veteran written in 1989, shortly before his death. He had been one of the guards at Grisdale Hall. He wrote, "I only saw First Lieutenant Franz von Werra a few times. He always seemed like someone who didn't belong there. Not because he was German, but because he wasn't made for captivity. Some people are born to be free. He was one of them. I'm glad he at least made it for 37 minutes. Perhaps that's the most honest tribute. Not from a general, not from a politician, but from a simple guard soldier who saw the humanity behind the myth. These stories must never be forgotten. They aren't just military history. They're human history. The history of people who did extraordinary things under extreme pressure. Some succeeded, some didn't, but all with a courage that deserves respect. If these historical truths are important to you, then support me with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every Super Thanks enables me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing surviving witnesses. This story is based on over 200 pages of British secret files, only declassified in 1997. Without your support, I can't continue my research. Help me preserve this story for future generations. The story of Franz von Werra ends with a question that no one can answer. As he crashed over the North Sea, he had seconds to realize what was happening. The engine failed. The plane plummeted. This time, there was no escape. Did he think of his escape in those last moments? Of the 37 minutes in the Spitfire Mark II? Of what could have been? We don't know. What we do know is that his body was never found. But his legacy survived in the stories that pilots tell each other, in the textbooks about escape attempts, in the archives that preserve his letters, in the memories of people who never give up. Franz von Werra flew for 37 minutes over England in a stolen Spitfire Mark II. He stalled just 2.5 miles from freedom. Some would say he failed, but perhaps that's the wrong perspective. Maybe we should say he tried, he risked, he fought until the end. And for 37 minutes, he was free in a way that most people will never experience. That's the essence of his story. Not the success, but the attempt. The moment when a person decides, I will not accept what I am given. I will fight for what I want. Even if I fail, I will have tried. The 37 minutes of Franz von Werra are a legacy of courage, desperation, determination, and human will. They remind us that the greatest stories aren't always the successful ones. Sometimes the greatest stories are those of people who risked everything and almost won. Almost. The word that defines his story. Almost escaped. Almost reached the coast. Almost attained freedom. But that almost isn't a failure. It's proof that he tried, and sometimes the trying itself is the heroism. What impressed you most about this story? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories. Grandfathers who were there, letters found in attics, war diaries that spanned generations. Share your family story from this time below. Every comment is a piece of history that we preserve together. Your stories are the living memory of a generation that will soon no longer be with us. Let's make sure their experiences are never forgotten.